The email didn't have my name in it. Not Dear Nora. Not even a cold, template-generated Dear Ms. Callahan. Just one sentence, centered on an otherwise blank screen, like it was too important to share space with a greeting. Or maybe like whoever built the automation was embarrassed enough to make it as small and forgettable as possible. Your position has been eliminated as part of a strategic restructuring initiative. Please return all company equipment by end of day Friday. That was it. 14 years of my life. 14 years of untangling other people's spaghetti code at 2 a.m, of missing my cousin's wedding because a release window slipped, of being the only woman in rooms full of men who called me efficient instead of brilliant, because brilliant made them uncomfortable in some way they never had the vocabulary to name. Reduced to a sentence that read like an out-of-office auto-reply. Reduced to fewer words than most of my own commit messages. No signature, no manager's name attached. Just a stamp at the bottom from an internal HR platform called Talentflow, which I have decided is possibly the most dystopian piece of branding a piece of software has ever been given. Right up there with calling a mass layoff a workforce optimization event, which is the actual phrase our internal memo used 2 days later, as if we were a spreadsheet that had simply been made more efficient rather than 41 human beings who had, until that Tuesday, had health insurance. That was 5 weeks ago. Now I was sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor. Not the couch, the floor. Because something about getting fired makes you regress to the emotional maturity of a golden retriever who's just been yelled at for something it doesn't fully understand. You just want to be somewhere low, somewhere close to the ground, somewhere it's harder to fall from. I was eating dry Cheerios straight from the box because washing a bowl felt like a multi-step project I did not currently have the executive function to complete. I was wearing the same pair of leggings I'd worn for 3 days running. They had a hole forming at the knee that I kept meaning to mend, and instead just kept sticking my finger through, over and over, the way you poke a bruise to check that it's still there, still real, still hurts exactly as much as you remember. My laptop, not the company one, they'd collected that within 48 hours via a courier so polite and so firm that I'd felt, absurdly, like a parolee who'd violated the terms of some release I never signed, sat open on a job board. I had refreshed that page so many times a day that its algorithm had started recommending me positions in cities I had never once searched for, as if it too had simply given up trying to understand what I actually wanted and had started guessing at random. Senior Platform Engineer, join our fast-paced, mission-driven team and help us disrupt the future. Translation. We want someone with 15 years of production experience who will accept a salary that hasn't adjusted for inflation since roughly the Clinton administration, plus equity in a company that will probably implode before any of it vests, and who will still type, "So excited to be here," with 2 exclamation points in the company Slack on day 1, unprompted, like a hostage reading a note on camera. I closed the tab. My eyes ached. My whole face ached, honestly. In that specific way where you've been clenching your jaw for weeks without noticing, because some downstairs part of your nervous system has quietly decided that unemployment is a low-grade emergency that never fully resolves, not even when you're asleep, not even when you're doing something as harmless as eating cereal out of a box on your kitchen floor at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday that felt exactly like every other Wednesday, which felt exactly like every Tuesday, which felt exactly like every day since the email. My phone buzzed against the counter. I didn't look at it right away. It was probably another recruiter circling back about a role that had already been filled internally 3 weeks earlier. A special, specific kind of professional cruelty nobody warns you about. Getting your hopes up about an opportunity that was already dead before you finished the application. I had learned, over 5 weeks, To let the first buzz go unanswered, the way you let a phone ring twice before picking up so you don't seem too eager. Except now it wasn't about seeming cool. It was about bracing myself. When I finally checked, it wasn't a recruiter. It was a headline, glowing in the trending sidebar of a tech news site I only opened anymore to doom scroll, the way some people pick compulsively at a scab they know they should leave alone. $640 million. Praxis Halcyon merger collapses amid sudden due diligence halt. I stared at it. Blinked. Read it again. Slower. The way you reread a text message from an ex to make sure you didn't misunderstand the tone. Like maybe there was some other Halcyon systems out there in the world. Some unrelated company that happened to share a name with the one that had employed me for 14 years, and then fired me 5 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Exactly 3 weeks. Before that very deal was scheduled to close with champagne and a press release and a stock price that would have made a dozen VPs richer than they had any right to be. There was no real explanation in the article itself. Just one line, attributed to nobody, from a source familiar with the transaction, saying that unexpected complications surrounding core intellectual property ownership had brought the acquisition to an abrupt standstill less than a month before signing. My stomach dropped the way it does when the car in front of you brakes for no visible reason, and your body understands the danger a full half-second before your brain catches up and starts asking questions. Core intellectual property. I had helped build almost everything they now quietly, nervously called core intellectual property. I had built the load balancing engine that let their platform survive 3 separate viral traffic spikes without falling over. Back when we were still small enough that on call meant me, personally, answering pages from a hospital parking garage during a year my mother was in chemo, because the release date could not move, because the release date was never allowed to move for anything. Not weddings, not funerals, not chemo, not anything that happened to the actual humans doing the actual work. And they had let me go, the way you let go of a printer that's jammed one too many times. A stapled note, no eye contact, out the door. My phone buzzed again. This time I looked. Jonah. They're losing their minds over here. Something about the original platform architecture. Call me when you can. My heart started doing something unpleasant and syncopated in my chest, a rhythm I didn't have a name for yet. Hey, real quick, before I keep going, if you're the kind of person who genuinely enjoys watching a company that treated a good employee like disposable garbage get precisely what's coming to it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I'm a tiny channel trying to claw my way to my first real audience, and every single subscription actually helps. Every one. Okay, back to it. Because it gets so much worse for them before it gets better for me. I picked the phone back up to call Jonah. My thumb hovered over his name for a long moment. They had fired me. They had let me twist for 5 weeks with a checking account balance that had, at one memorable point on a Sunday night, dipped into single digits, while they sat 3 weeks from popping champagne over a $640 million payday that half of them had never earned with their own 2 hands. And now something had gone catastrophically, publicly wrong for them, and somehow, impossibly, my name was already tangled up in the wreckage before I'd even called anyone or said a single word. I didn't call Jonah, not yet. Instead, I did something I hadn't let myself do in the 5 weeks since they'd walked me out. I opened my old personal terminal, dug up the external hard drive I still had from before legal sent that company-wide memo instructing everyone to please ensure all local repositories are securely wiped in accordance with updated data governance policy. A memo that had, at the time, made me feel faintly criminal for the crime of having done my job diligently for over a decade. And I started scrolling back through old code the way other people scroll through old photos of a relationship that ended badly. Layer by layer, commit by commit. Like an archaeologist picking carefully through the bones of a life she doesn't technically own anymore, but still remembers building with her own hands. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered it. Until it didn't. Buried inside a block of core load distribution logic, tucked into a comment where nobody but another working engineer would ever think to look, sat a single line that stopped my breath in my chest. Filed separately per DO's recommendation. Better an ugly insurance policy than none at all. DO Desmond Okafor. My mentor. The man who had trained me from the day I walked in the door. A nervous, overqualified 26-year-old, protected me through 2 rounds of layoffs that took better engineers than either of us, and then gotten unceremoniously restructured out of the company himself 4 years earlier, right around the time he'd started saying things to me in the break room like, "Never trust a company that installs a kombucha tap and calls it culture, instead of just paying you fairly and leaving it at that." A cold prickle worked its way slowly down my spine, vertebra by vertebra. I picked my phone back up, not to call Jonah, to go to the United States Patent and Trademark Office website. I didn't fully know what I was looking for yet, but some old animal part of my brain, the same part that used to sense a production server was about to fall over a full 10 minutes before the monitoring alerts ever fired, was telling me, quietly and with absolute certainty, that whatever I was about to find had been out there in the world looking for me for a very long time. The letter came on a Tuesday, which felt like a specific and deliberate act of cosmic malice, though I recognize now that lawyers do not, in fact, coordinate their mailings around my personal relationship to the calendar. Tuesdays are the emotional landfill of the week, too far from the small mercy of Friday to hope for anything, too far from the forgiveness of Sunday to properly rest, just a flat, gray stretch of nothing. The kind of day that exists purely so the other 6 can feel like they have some meaning by comparison. It arrived certified mail, hand-delivered by a postal worker who had the weary, 1,000-yard stare of a man who had personally delivered a great deal of bad news that particular year and had simply at some point stopped letting any of it touch him on the way through. I signed for it, confused, holding a heavy cream envelope with an embossed return address that made my stomach drop before I'd even gotten it fully open. Whitcomb, Farrow & Scions, LLP, Corporate Litigation and Strategy. The kind of letterhead that says, in a typeface that probably cost more to license than my monthly rent, "We have money, we have lawyers, and neither of those things is running low anytime soon, so choose your next move very carefully." I opened it the way you'd diffuse something, slowly, with both hands, half convinced that moving too fast would set something off that could not be unset off. "Dear Miss Callahan," it began, as if they hadn't just reached directly into the wreckage of my entire adult life with a gloved hand and started rummaging around. "We represent the interests of Praxis Dynamics, Inc. in connection with the pending acquisition of Halcyon Systems, Inc., your former employer. We are writing to request a meeting to discuss the ownership, licensing status, and transferability of United States Patent Number 9,441,208,772, which lists you as sole primary inventor." I read it 3 separate times, once in pure disbelief, once in outright panic, and once in that strange, syrupy slow-motion terror that's usually reserved for watching a full cup of coffee tip in agonizing slow motion, screen first, onto an open laptop. I did not have a patent. At least, I did not think I did. In 14 years, no one, not one manager, not one VP, not one skip level in a single one-on-one I'd ever sat through, had ever once used the word patent in reference to anything I had personally worked on. I remembered filling out an invention disclosure form once, years ago, half-heartedly, the way you fill out an expense report you don't expect to be reimbursed for. I dropped the letter, scrambled for my browser, and typed the number into the USPTO search bar with the exact shaking urgency you use when you're Googling whether a rash might actually be something serious. The page loaded. My internet stalled at 70-something%, as if the universe itself wanted one more private moment to enjoy my suffering before letting me in on the joke. I hit the desk with my palm. It refreshed. There it was. Title: Adaptive Load Redistribution for Decentralized Modular Server Architectures. Inventor: Nora M. Callahan. Not the company's name anywhere on it. Not shared credit with our old CTO, who had once introduced me to a visiting client as one of our support-level engineering resources. A phrase I have genuinely never once forgiven him for, and probably never will. Not even now. Not even with everything that came after. Not buried under a dozen convenient co-inventors who had contributed nothing beyond a title, but somehow still ended up listed on every single internal white paper because their org chart position demanded it. Just my name. Alone. Filing date: 4 years ago. The exact year Desmond got pushed out. The exact year I remembered him cornering me by the elevator bank with a manila folder in his hand and a look on his face like a man who had just watched a storm form on a horizon that no one else in the building could see yet. Not even the meteorologists. Not even the people whose entire job was watching the sky. I sat back in my chair, pulse jackhammering somewhere behind my ears. I could still hear my old CEO's fake concerned voice from 5 weeks earlier, floating up from wherever memories like that go to live rent-free forever. This isn't personal, Nora. It's a strategic realignment. Strategic my entire ass. They had realigned me straight into the unemployment line while they popped champagne over a $500 million payday, give or take. And now that payday was circling the drain because of the woman currently eating cereal out of a mug with a $12 checking balance and an inbox absolutely papered in, "We've decided to move forward with other candidates," rejection letters. Most of which, I noted with grim amusement, had at least had the decency to include my actual name. I suddenly realized that all those strange, tight, panicked looks I'd caught on former coworkers' faces in the last few days, glimpsed across a coffee shop, mentioned in a friend's offhand text, might not have been about the merger collapsing at all. They might have been about who had collapsed it. I stared at the screen, trying to physically wrap my head around it. I had power. Real power. The kind you cannot apply for on a job board. The kind that doesn't come with a ping pong table or a fast-paced culture bullet point. The kind that makes $640 million mergers collapse and law firms with embossed letterhead send certified mail on the single worst day of the week. My cat jumped up onto the desk and knocked the Cheerios mug clean off the edge. I didn't even flinch. I just kept staring at my own name on the screen like it finally, genuinely, belonged there. It came back to me in pieces, the way memories do when you're suddenly given a reason to want them back. Fluorescent lighting that hummed just slightly off-key. The specific burnt smell of break room coffee that had been sitting on the warmer since 8 a.m. The particular deep tissue ache of a keyboard that's been typed on for 9 straight hours without a real break. Desmond had barged into my cubicle that day, waving a manila folder around like it was a subpoena he was personally serving me. He'd set it down hard enough on my desk to slosh the Diet Dr. Pepper I'd been surviving on that entire quarter. "You're filing this," he said. No hello, no preamble. Desmond didn't believe in preambles. He thought they were a waste of everyone's finite time on Earth, and he said so, often, loudly, in meetings that absolutely called for a preamble. I blinked at the folder like it might bite me. Filing what? This is IP's job, Desmond. I already submitted the disclosure to compliance weeks ago. You're filing this under your own name, sole inventor. No corporate co-authors, not even me. I laughed. Too loud, too nervous. The laugh you do when someone says something that sounds unhinged, but you're not yet sure if they're joking. Desmond, I'm a mid-level engineer. The company funded the entire research sprint. Legally, this would be considered future leverage. He cut in, and his eyes went flat and hard in a way I had genuinely never once seen on his face before. Not in 3 years of working directly under him. Not even the day corporate flew in from the coast and cut our whole team's headcount in half over a single afternoon. They don't just eat your work here, Nora. They wear your bones like trophies and call it team synergy in the all-hands deck. I remember fidgeting with the lanyard around my neck, running my thumb over the plastic edge of my badge the way I always did when I was nervous. Legal is never going to approve this. That's exactly why you're not asking legal, he said. You're filing it personally, outside of company channels, on your own time, with your own address on the paperwork. Nobody in this entire building will notice for years. And by the time they do notice, it will be far, far too late for them to do anything about it except pay for it, in full, with interest. It had sounded, at the time, deeply and completely unhinged. Like stockpiling canned beans and bottled water in your basement in case of a meteor strike that statistically was never going to happen to you specifically. Except apparently, while the rest of us were eating stale bagels at the Friday afternoon social and quietly pretending our stock option grants were a real functioning retirement plan, Desmond had been building a bunker under all our feet the entire time, brick by brick, and nobody had noticed because Desmond looked, on any given day, like a man who was 3 bad nights of sleep away from a full breakdown, which made it very easy to dismiss whatever he said as background noise. Why me? I'd asked him. Why not one of the other senior engineers? Why not yourself? He'd looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Because you actually built it, start to finish, with your own hands, while everyone else was busy taking credit in the stand-up. And because you're the only person on this floor who still thinks the company might actually be fair to you if you just work hard enough and wait long enough. I need that patent to belong to someone who still believes that. Because someone who still believes it will file it quietly, correctly, and without drawing attention to what she's doing. Someone who's already cynical, like me, would botch it out of spite before it ever got approved. I'd agreed in the end because I trusted him more than I trusted almost anyone else in that building. And because some small, stubborn, unkillable part of me liked the idea, even then, even before I understood what it actually meant, of owning something real. Not stock options that could be repriced into worthlessness with one board vote. Not PTO days that evaporated the moment I was inconvenient. Not a plastic Rock Star of the Quarter trophy with my name misspelled on the little engraved plate, which had, in fact, happened to me once 2 years earlier, and which I had kept anyway, out of some masochistic impulse I never fully examined. Something that couldn't be deleted by a bad quarter and a new CEO with an ego roughly the size of the Tesla he leased through the company. Then I'd forgotten about it completely, buried it under years of bug fixes and performance reviews that always, somehow, found a diplomatic way to describe me as not quite director ready yet. A phrase I heard so many times across so many years that I eventually stopped hearing it as an insult and started hearing it as a kind of ambient weather, background noise you learn to walk through without an umbrella. Desmond hadn't forgotten. Desmond had seen this exact moment coming down the tracks like a slow train through heavy fog, 4 full years before it finally arrived. And now I was standing directly on those same tracks, holding the lever, and I hadn't even realized my hand was on it until the train was already close enough to hear. I want to be honest about something before I go any further, because I think it matters to understanding why all of this hit me the way it did. I didn't hate Halcyon Systems for a long time. For most of those 14 years, I actually loved it, or loved some early, scrappy, better version of it that I kept mistaking for the company it had actually become underneath me. One acquisition and one funding round at a time. Until one day I looked up, and the floor I was standing on wasn't the floor I remembered building. I joined when Halcyon was 11 people crammed into a converted warehouse space that smelled permanently of solder and old carpet. Back when our CEO, a different CEO, a woman named Priscilla who left 2 years later to start something else entirely, and who I still think about fondly, used to personally bring donuts on Fridays and knew the names of everyone's pets. I was 26. I had just left a soul-crushing job at a company so large that I had at one point gone 6 months without ever once speaking directly to my actual manager, communicating entirely through a ticketing system that assigned my requests a priority number instead of a name. At Halcyon, in those early years, I felt like a person. I felt like an engineer whose ideas mattered enough that people actually implemented them instead of nodding politely and doing whatever the loudest man in the room had already decided to do before the meeting started. I stayed late not because anyone made me, but because I was building something, actually building it. Watching an idea turn into an architecture, turn into a product, turn into a company that people used every single day without knowing my name, which was, somehow, its own quiet kind of satisfaction. Then came the first acquisition, Halcyon buying a smaller competitor, absorbing their team, their tech debt, their culture problems, and something in the building shifted, subtly. The way a house settles after a foundation crack you don't notice until the doors stop closing right. Then came the second funding round and the first real layoff, and the first time I heard the phrase, "We need to think about this more strategically," used to justify something that was, in practice, cruel. Then came Cole Whitfield. Cole arrived as our new VP of Product 3 years before he somehow, through a sequence of boardroom maneuvers I never fully understood and frankly never wanted to, ended up CEO. He had the specific energy of a man who had read exactly one book about leadership and had decided it contained everything worth knowing. He talked constantly about moving fast and radical candor, while somehow never once being either fast or candid himself. He renamed our engineering sprints to growth cycles for reasons no one ever adequately explained. He once ended an all hands by telling all 40 of us in the room that we were not just employees, we're family. 4 days before that same family lost 11 people in a single Friday afternoon email blast, none of whom got so much as a goodbye video call. I stayed anyway. I stayed because the work itself was still good, still mine. Still something I was proud of, even when the people around it stopped deserving that pride. I stayed because Desmond was there, a steady hand in a building that kept getting less steady by the quarter. I stayed because leaving felt, somehow, like admitting that 14 years of my one finite life had been a mistake. And I was not ready to admit that. Not yet. Not while there was still a version of the story where it had all been worth something. I stayed through my mother's diagnosis, when Desmond quietly, without asking anyone's permission, rearranged 3 other engineers' on-call rotations so I could be in Phoenix for 2 weeks straight without anyone in leadership even noticing I was gone. Because Desmond understood, in a way our official HR policy never did, that some emergencies don't wait for open enrollment. I stayed through the year our platform nearly collapsed under a traffic spike that made national news. The year I personally rewrote the entire load distribution layer from the ground up over 11 consecutive sleepless days, fueled by gas station coffee and a stubbornness that felt, at the time, like loyalty. And now, in hindsight, feels a little bit like something closer to self-harm. And then, 3 weeks before the champagne was supposed to pop, they let me go with a sentence that didn't even have my name in it. I think about that a lot. Not the firing itself. Firings happen. Companies restructure. I understand the mechanics of capitalism well enough not to be naive about that part. What I think about is the sentence. The absence of my name. 14 years, and they couldn't be bothered to type 6 letters. I didn't call Jonah. I called Desmond. Except I didn't call at first. I texted, because some conversations need to start with the same slow, deliberate precision you'd use typing out the first message to someone you haven't spoken to in years and aren't entirely sure still wants to hear from you. Me. Hi, Desmond. It's Nora. Remember that patent you made me file? I think the thing you warned me about just happened. I hit send and set the phone face down on the coffee table, half expecting to wait days, maybe longer, for a reply from a man who had, as far as I knew, fully checked out of tech culture entirely and was spending his retirement somewhere hot and dry, doing something vague and unglamorous with citrus trees that he'd mentioned exactly once in a holiday card 2 years ago and never brought up again. He called at 1:43 in the morning. I was half asleep on the couch, mouth dry from too many stress-eaten pretzels, the television murmuring some rerun I hadn't actually watched a single frame of, when my phone buzzed against my ribs like a defibrillator going off inside my own chest. Desmond, what took you so long? His voice hadn't changed at all in 4 years. Gravel soaked in black coffee, laced with a permanent, weary contempt for anyone who had ever worn a company badge unironically, myself included most days. I've been waiting 4 years for that letter to show up, he said, without a hello, exactly the way he'd handed me that folder all those years ago. I sat bolt upright, all the sleepiness gone out of me in an instant. You knew this would happen? All this time? I hoped, he said. I hoped those overpaid children in blazers would get cocky enough eventually to make a mistake this big. And they did. Right on schedule, more or less. Tell me something. Did they fire you before or after they announced the merger publicly? 3 weeks before. No warning, just an automated email that didn't even have my name in it. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like a rusty gate swinging open somewhere. They always clean house right before the cameras show up for the photo op, scrubbing a crime scene before the open house starts. I rubbed my eyes hard enough to see spots. Why didn't you just tell me, back then, what I actually had in my hands? Why let me sit on something like that for 4 years without knowing? Because if I'd told you, it wouldn't have worked, he said, flat and immediate, like he'd already rehearsed the answer to this exact question 100 times in his own head, waiting for the day I'd finally ask it. You're too decent, Nora. You always have been, and I mean that as a compliment and an insult in equal measure. If I'd told you what that patent could really do, you'd have marched straight up to legal and tried to warn them, tried to be the reasonable one, tried to fix it quietly before anyone got hurt. Or worse, the second Cole so much as smiled at you and called you part of the family, you'd have signed the whole thing right back over for free, out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to people who never once felt any loyalty back toward you. That's extremely rude. Also, unfortunately, probably accurate. He ignored that entirely, the way he ignored most things that weren't strictly load-bearing to the point he was making. That patent is the load-bearing wall of their entire current platform, Nora. They gutted every piece of the old legacy architecture over the last 3 years and rebuilt the whole stack directly around what you designed, whether they fully understood that or not at the time. I told you back then it was insurance. I never told you what, specifically, it was insurance against, because you didn't need to carry that weight around for 4 extra years of your life. One of us carrying it was enough. I could hear something faint in the background on his end. Crickets, maybe, or a sprinkler system ticking somewhere out in the dark. Somewhere warm, somewhere very far away from my kitchen floor. Okay, I said slowly, my brain finally starting to catch up to my racing heart. So what do I actually do now? First thing, they're going to try to renegotiate quietly before this goes any further. Offer you some kind of settlement, dress it up as generosity, maybe even dangle your old job back at you like a chew toy. I could just take the settlement and no. His voice went cold and flat in a way that cut the sentence off before I'd even finished forming it. You do not negotiate with them right now. You do not apologize. You do not explain yourself. Not one single word of explanation. Do you understand me? You dictate terms. You are not built for begging, thank God, and that is exactly what they're counting on you doing. I'm not you, Desmond. I don't have your scorched earth energy. I've spent 14 years trying to be reasonable in that building. Exactly, he said. And for the first time all conversation, something almost gentle crept into his voice. That is exactly why this is going to work. They underestimated you for 14 straight years because you're quiet, because you're careful, because you never once raised your voice in a meeting, even when you had every right to. They mistook all of that for weakness instead of what it actually always was, which was patience. Right now, without even fully understanding it yet, you terrify them more than anyone else in that building ever has. I let the silence sit there between us for a moment, heavy and strange and, if I'm being fully honest, a little bit thrilling in a way I didn't quite have language for yet. Here's what you do first, he said, businesslike again, the gentleness gone as fast as it had arrived. You do not respond to a single soul from Halcyon. Not HR, not internal legal, not that walking LinkedIn thought leadership post they call a CEO. Every single word you say to any of them without a lawyer present becomes ammunition they will use against you later. I promise you that. I don't have a lawyer, Desmond. You do now. I heard drawers opening on his end, papers shuffling, the small domestic sounds of a man rifling through some old address book at nearly 2 a.m, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Priya Anand, IP litigation. We used to call her the Kraken years ago, back when she was cutting her teeth on patent trolls twice her size and eating every single one of them for breakfast without so much as a napkin. Looks like she stepped directly out of a magazine spread. Argues like she's been personally, deeply wronged by every single defendant she's ever faced in a courtroom. I'm texting you her number now. Is she going to be expensive? She's not free, no. But she loves a contingency case, especially one with this much blood already visible in the water. And Nora, right now, in this exact moment, you are the blood and the shark, both at the same time. And you don't even fully know it yet. He hung up before I could say anything else. The way he always used to end conversations back in the office, mid-thought, like punctuation was for people with time to waste. 30 seconds later, a text came through. Desmond. Priya Anand, number. Tell her I sent you and that you're the nuke. I didn't overthink it. I dialed immediately, before the fear could catch up with the adrenaline and talk me out of it. A sleepy voice answered on the third ring. Anand? Hi, my name is Nora Callahan. I have a strange question about a patent I apparently own, and a company that fired me 5 weeks ago and is now trying to figure out how to buy my silence about it. A long pause on the line, then a slow, delighted laugh, the specific laugh of someone who has genuinely been a little bit bored for a while and has just been handed a very, very good problem to solve. You, she said, have my full and undivided attention. Don't say another word to anyone until we talk properly. I'm serious. Not one more word. Priya Anand's office was nothing like I expected from a woman Desmond had described, half affectionately, as someone who eats NDAs for breakfast. I'd pictured something severe and gray, all glass and chrome and intimidation. Instead, her office had actual plants, real ones, thriving. Not the sad fake fern collecting dust that sat in Halcyon's lobby for 14 years. And a wall covered in framed newspaper clippings of cases she'd apparently won, several of which I vaguely remembered reading about years earlier without ever connecting the name to a real person. She was younger than I expected, too, sharp-featured, dressed in a blazer that fit her like it had been built around her specifically, which it probably had. She shook my hand with a grip that told you everything you needed to know about how seriously she took the next hour of both our lives. Sit, she said. Tell me everything, from the beginning, and don't skip the boring parts, because the boring parts are usually where the money is hiding. So I told her. The email, the 5 weeks of Cheerios and rejection letters, the headline, the comment buried in the old code, the letter from Whitcomb, Farrow, and Signs, the patent listing my name and my name alone, Desmond's midnight phone call. She listened without interrupting once, taking notes on an actual legal pad with an actual pen, which felt, somehow, more serious than if she'd been typing. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. Do you understand what you're actually holding, Nora? A patent, I said, for work I did years ago. You're holding the deed to the house they've been living in, she said. They didn't just use your invention. Based on what you're describing, they rebuilt their entire product architecture around it over the last several years, which means, functionally, every dollar of revenue Halcyon has generated since that rebuild runs, at some level, through code that implements what your patent covers. And you own that patent, personally, outright. Not the company, you. So what does that actually mean in practice? In practice, she said, tapping her pen against the pad, it means Halcyon Systems has been infringing on your personal intellectual property for years without a license. And they have absolutely no idea how deep that hole goes yet, because their own internal IP audit clearly missed it. Otherwise, this deal never would have gotten as far as due diligence before falling apart. It means Praxis's lawyers found what Halcyon's own lawyers should have found years ago. And now, Praxis is terrified, because they're about to spend hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring a company whose core technology might not even be legally theirs to sell. And it means you, Nora Callahan, currently sitting across from me in leggings with a hole in the knee, no offense, hold more leverage over a $640 million transaction than anyone else currently in that building, including the man whose name is on the door. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift underneath my ribs, some tectonic plate I hadn't known was capable of moving. "What do I do?" I said finally. "You do nothing rash," she said. "You do not sign anything. You do not accept a single phone call from anyone at Halcyon without me on the line. And you let them come to you. Because right now, every single day that passes without a resolution costs them more than it costs you. Time is not on their side. It has never once, in the entire history of corporate mergers, been on the side of the company trying to hide something during due diligence." She slid a business card across the desk toward me, along with, I noticed, a second one, her cell number handwritten on the back in blue ink. "Welcome to the food chain," she said, with a small, sharp smile that made me understand, instantly and completely, exactly why Desmond had chosen her. My phone rang at 8:12 sharp the next morning, so precisely on schedule that it felt like it had been calendared by someone whose entire job description was ruining other people's mornings for a living. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the area code. Corporate headquarters, belly of the beast. I let it ring twice before answering, mostly because Priya had told me, in no uncertain terms, never to seem eager, not even accidentally, not even in the half second before you say hello. "Callahan." "Hey, Nora, it's Cole." That same warm, over-rehearsed tone. The verbal equivalent of expensive cologne sprayed directly into a landfill in a desperate attempt to cover the smell. Cole Whitfield, CEO of Halcyon Systems, king of the all-hands vision deck. The man who, across 14 years, had said my actual name to my face maybe 4 separate times total, and had once, in front of a visiting enterprise client, introduced me as one of our support-level engineering resources, while standing directly beside an architecture diagram I had personally designed, drawn, and defended in front of the board. "Cole," I said flat. "Wow, you sound great. Listen, I know it's been a minute since we last talked, and honestly, I hated how things wrapped up with your, departure. That's not at all how I wanted that whole chapter to close out, you know? But hey, water under the bridge, right? Fresh start energy?" I said nothing. He barreled on, undeterred, the exact way men like Cole always do the moment silence makes them uncomfortable, which is nearly always. Because silence doesn't flatter them the way their own voice does. "So, funny thing. We've been going back through some old records during the merger's due diligence process. You know how messy that whole process gets. And it turns out there was this tiny clerical hiccup with one of the old patent filings. That adaptive load balancing work you helped out with, remember?" Helped out with. I had written every single line of that logic during a stretch of my life when I was answering pages from a hospital parking garage between chemo appointments that weren't even mine. "Oh," I said. "That one, the one under my name." "Right, exactly. Total oversight, honestly. Nobody's fault, really. Just one of those things that slips through the cracks in a company our size. Should have been filed as a joint company disclosure from the very start. I mean, so many hands went into that whole project over the years, right? It's basically a big soup at that point. Everybody stirring the pot." He actually chuckled at his own metaphor, warm and easy, like this was some charming misunderstanding over a shared casserole recipe at a neighborhood potluck, instead of a $640 million legal catastrophe currently unfolding in real time. I imagined, very calmly, putting a soup ladle directly through his teeth, and found the image genuinely soothing. We'd love to make it right, he continued, oblivious, or performing obliviousness so well I couldn't tell the difference anymore. We're prepared to offer a generous retroactive bonus, effective immediately, plus a formal written acknowledgement of your contributions for the historical record. Get everyone squared away before the merger closes. Real clean slate energy, you know? Move forward together. I let the silence stretch out on the line until it started, faintly, to hum with tension. Cole, I said finally, this call is being recorded for legal documentation purposes. Please do not contact me directly again. Wait, Nora, hang on a second. We can absolutely talk this through like adults. There's no need to bring lawyers into something that's really just a family matter. This call is over. My attorney will follow up with her fee structure for any and all future communication regarding this matter. Good luck with due diligence. I hear it's brutal this time of year. I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From something closer to pure adrenaline, the real kind. The kind that doesn't come from a title or a year-end bonus, or an executive assistant named Belle booking your SoulCycle classes for you 3 weeks in advance. I texted Priya immediately. He called. Lowballed me hard. Tried to buy it back with a fake bonus and some group hug language about family. She replied in under a minute. Good. Let him sweat overnight. I'm drafting a formal cease and desist on your behalf regarding any further direct contact, and I'm quietly letting Praxis's outside counsel know, through the appropriate channels, that you might be open to an independent licensing conversation, separate from any negotiation with Halcyon. Let's see exactly how long it takes before that board starts eating itself alive from the inside. I smiled. The first real, full smile I'd had in 5 weeks. The kind that actually reached my eyes instead of just my mouth. Cole had made his opening move, clumsy and self-serving and dressed up in the language of family. I had made mine. Now it was their turn to figure out how to dance to a song they hadn't chosen. It started with a laptop, my old company one, the one I'd left behind the exact moment my badge access died mid-elevator ride on my very last day, along with, apparently, my professional dignity. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. One more small possession I'd been too stunned by the whole situation to fight for, packed into a cardboard box by a security guard who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Now, 3 days after Cole's call, I got an email from Halcyon IT titled Urgent, Account Security Review. All corporate throat clearing wrapped tightly around a veiled threat. As part of an internal compliance audit, they required immediate access to any personal devices that may contain proprietary materials, including but not limited to software artifacts, platform documentation, or related source code. They were phishing, and they were, unmistakably, panicking. 2 hours after that, a thick FedEx envelope arrived from Halcyon HR, stamped confidential in aggressive red lettering, like it contained a nuclear launch code instead of what it actually was. A beautifully, carefully worded hostage note, dressed up in the borrowed clothes of a legal document. They accused me of possible misappropriation of internal development tools and cited Section 5B of my old employment agreement, implying, without quite outright stating, that my mere continued possession of certain development artifacts could constitute a material breach of contract. They were bluffing hard with a pair of twos and hoping, desperately, that I didn't know how to read the table. Priya snorted audibly, actually snorted, when I forwarded it to her that evening. Classic scare tactic, she said over the phone. If they genuinely, seriously believed you'd stolen anything of value, this letter would have come from outside counsel on formal letterhead threatening specific statutory damages. Instead, it came from someone in internal HR with a Microsoft Word watermark still faintly visible in the document footer, which tells me they typed this up in about 20 panicked minutes and hit send before anyone senior enough could stop them. Then came the phone call I'd been dreading without fully realizing I was dreading it. It was Jonah. Sweet, perpetually nervous, a genuinely terrible liar even over the phone. The guy I used to pair program with on long nights fueled by energy drinks and a shared, quiet, existential dread about our collective career choices that we'd never once said out loud to each other. Not directly. Hey, Nora. So, I got asked to check in. Just, catching up. Seeing how you're doing and stuff. I closed my eyes, already knowing exactly where this was going before he'd finished the sentence. They put you up to this, didn't they? What? No. I mean, well, kind of. Cole sort of asked if someone with a, personal connection to you could maybe float the idea of resolving things quietly, off the record. Between friends, basically. I could hear the shame curdling in his voice, thick and unmistakable. The specific sound of a decent person being asked to do an indecent thing by someone with more power than him. They're scared, Jonah, I said quietly. He didn't answer because there was genuinely nothing to say to that. Tell Cole he should have sent a lawyer instead of a guilt trip wearing your voice. And tell him next time he wants to manipulate someone through an old coworker, he should pick someone who didn't personally write the system he can no longer legally sell. There was a long pause. For what it's worth, Jonah finally said, quiet. I hope you take him for everything. He did the same thing to me, smaller scale. Cut my equity grant right before the last funding round closed, buried it in some fine print about refresh eligibility. I never said anything because I was scared. You're the first person who's ever made him scared back. That landed somewhere soft in my chest. Something I hadn't expected. Thank you for telling me that, I said, and meant it. Just be careful, okay? He's not going to stop with polite phone calls forever. I hung up, and 5 minutes later, my phone lit up again. Not a call this time, a text from Priya. Update. Praxis Legal reached out privately through a back channel. They want to schedule a direct licensing conversation. Just you. No Halcyon in the room at all. I stared at the screen for a long moment. That single sentence rearranged everything I thought I understood about the shape of this situation. Praxis, the company that was supposed to buy Halcyon, the acquirer, the one with all the leverage in the original deal, no longer cared, apparently, about my former employer at all. They cared about the assets sitting underneath the wreckage. And I was the asset. Priya called moments later, her voice electric in a way I had never once heard from a lawyer before, not even during our first meeting. This is a kingmaker moment, Nora. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You are not a former employee anymore. You are a gatekeeper, standing directly in front of the only door that matters. What do? We go quiet. We meet with them. We hear their number, whatever it is, and then you ask yourself one honest question, alone, before you answer them. How much do you actually want revenge? And how much do you want power? Because you are about to be offered a serious, real amount of both, quite possibly in the very same sentence. I want to tell you the story went smoothly from there. It didn't. If there's one thing I've learned about people like Cole Whitfield, it's that cornered men don't get more honest. They get more creative. 3 days after Priya's update about Praxis, a story appeared on a mid-tier tech gossip blog, the kind that mostly covers funding rounds and the occasional founder meltdown. The headline made my stomach drop clean through the floor. Former Halcyon engineer accused of unauthorized data retention, sources say. There was no byline anyone could trace, no named sources, just vague, poisonous language about concerns raised internally and an ongoing review into potential misuse of proprietary information by a departed employee. My name wasn't in the piece directly. They were smart enough, or their lawyers were smart enough, to avoid that. But anyone who knew the situation, anyone at all connected to Halcyon or Praxis or the wider industry gossip mill would know exactly who they meant within about 4 seconds of reading it. I called Priya, hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with adrenaline this time and everything to do with plain fear. They planted this, I said. Cole planted this. Almost certainly, she said, calm in a way that somehow made me calmer too, just by proximity. It's a pressure tactic. They want to poison the well before you sit down with Praxis, make you look unstable or dishonest so their legal team can argue you're not a credible licensing partner. It's ugly, it's cowardly, and it's also, legally speaking, a gift. How is this a gift? Because it's defamatory, Nora, and it's traceable. Unnamed sources close to an internal review that, as far as we know, does not officially exist, published through a blog with a history of running planted stories for companies that pay for favorable coverage elsewhere on the site. I've already got someone pulling the site's disclosed sponsorship history. If Halcyon's fingerprints are anywhere near this, and I'd bet my entire retirement account they are, we now have a second, independent cause of action against them, completely separate from the patent dispute. Tortious interference at minimum, possibly defamation per se, depending on how a court reads the implication. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something in my chest unclench slightly, just slightly. So what do I do about the story itself? People are going to read it. People I used to work with, people I might want to work for someday. You do nothing publicly, not yet, Priya said. No angry tweet, no rebuttal post, nothing that gives it more oxygen than it already has. I'm sending a formal retraction demand to the blog within the hour, copying Halcyon's outside counsel directly on it, which will make it very clear to everyone in that boardroom that we know exactly what they did and exactly how amateur it was. Trust me, nothing rattles a general counsel faster than watching their client do something this stupid 3 weeks before a deal closing. The retraction demand worked faster than either of us expected. By the next morning, the blog had quietly edited the piece, stripped it down to a single vague paragraph, then deleted it entirely by early afternoon, replaced with a small italicized note about an earlier version of this story not meeting our editorial standards, which is the internet's version of a full, silent surrender. But the damage, small as it was, had done something useful too. It confirmed, beyond any doubt in my mind, exactly what kind of fight I was actually in. This wasn't going to be settled with quiet professionalism and a fair conversation over coffee. Cole Whitfield was going to keep swinging, wildly and dirtily, for as long as he had anything left to swing with. Good, I remember thinking, surprising myself with how little fear was actually left in the thought by the time it finished forming. Let him swing. Every swing he took now was just more rope. The meeting with Praxis happened in a hotel conference room, not their actual offices, which Priya explained was deliberate. Neutral ground, no chance of running into anyone from Halcyon in a lobby, no paper trail suggesting Praxis was negotiating around their acquisition target's back, even though, functionally, that was exactly what was happening. Their side of the table was smaller than I expected, just 2 people. A woman named Denise Okoro, Praxis's general counsel, sharp-eyed and precise in the way career litigators often are, and the younger man named Adam, who I gathered from the way he deferred to her on everything, was there mostly to take notes and eventually explain all of this to someone even more senior. "Miss Callahan," Denise said, shaking my hand with exactly the right amount of firmness, enough to signal respect, not so much as to signal aggression. "Thank you for meeting with us directly. I'll be candid with you, because I think candor is going to serve both of us well here. Our due diligence team found your patent 11 days ago, and it changed the entire risk calculus of this acquisition overnight." "How bad is it?" I asked, "from your side?" She glanced at Priya briefly, a professional courtesy, before answering. "Our engineering team estimates that roughly 60 to 70% of Halcyon's current production platform implements, in some form, the load distribution architecture your patent describes. If we close this acquisition without resolving your ownership claim, we are, in effect, purchasing a $640 million company that does not fully own its own core product. That is not a risk our board is willing to carry, no matter how attractive the rest of the deal looks on paper." "So you're walking away from the acquisition?" "We were prepared to," she said, "until it occurred to someone on our team, rather late in the process, that there might be a much cleaner path forward. One that doesn't require us to purchase Halcyon systems at all in order to get the thing we actually wanted from this deal in the first place." I felt the room tilt slightly, in the good way, the way a room tilts right before something enormous becomes clear. "You wanted the technology," I said slowly, "not the company." "We wanted the technology," Denise confirmed. "Halcyon was always, in a sense, a vehicle for acquiring it, a vehicle with a great deal of unnecessary weight attached, legacy contracts, a bloated executive team, ongoing litigation exposure we've since discovered in 3 separate jurisdictions, a company culture our own diligence team described, and I'm quoting an internal memo here, as concerningly toxic at the leadership layer. If we can license the core technology directly from its actual sole legal owner, we get everything we wanted, none of the baggage, and we do it for a fraction of the price we were about to pay for the whole company." Adam finally spoke, sliding a folder across the table toward me and Priya. "This is our opening proposal. Exclusive licensing rights to the patent, plus an advisory role for you personally, given your unmatched familiarity with the architecture. We'd want you actively involved in the integration, not just as a name on a license agreement." Priya opened the folder, scanned the first page for exactly 4 seconds, and set it back down without any visible reaction, which I was learning was her particular brand of poker face. "This is a serious opening number," she said, "and we appreciate that you came prepared to negotiate in good faith rather than waste everyone's time. We'll need 48 hours to review the full terms properly, but I want to be direct with you as well, since you've been direct with us. My client is not interested in simply being compensated fairly. She's interested in making sure that the company that spent 5 weeks trying to intimidate, smear, and manipulate her into giving this up for free understands, publicly and unambiguously, exactly what happened here and why." Denise's mouth curved, just slightly, into something that wasn't quite a smile but was clearly its close cousin. "That," she said, "we can absolutely work with." We shook hands. I walked out of that hotel conference room feeling something I hadn't felt in 5 weeks, possibly longer than that, possibly not since the very early years of Halcyon, back when Priscilla still brought donuts on Fridays and knew everyone's dog's name. I felt like the person actually holding the pen. I called my mother that night, mostly because I needed to hear a voice that had nothing to do with mergers or patents or men in blazers who called employees family right up until the moment it cost them money to mean it. She's in remission now, 2 years clean, and her voice on the phone still does this small catching thing at the start of every call, like some part of her is always bracing to hear bad news before she lets herself hear the good kind. I told her everything, start to finish, sitting on my kitchen floor again, though this time out of habit rather than despair. "So let me understand this," she said when I finished. "The people who fired you are now afraid of you." "Very afraid, yes." "And the other company, the one that was going to buy them, wants to work with you directly instead." "That's the current offer, yes." There was a long pause on the line, the kind she used to take before telling me something she'd clearly been thinking about for longer than the conversation itself. "Nora, honey, I need you to actually answer something for me, and I want you to really think about it before you answer, not just say the first tough-sounding thing that comes to mind. What do you actually want out of this? Not what would make Cole Whitfield suffer the most. What would make you okay?" I sat with that question longer than I expected to, longer than felt entirely comfortable. "I want them to know I mattered," I said finally, surprising myself with how simple it came out after 5 weeks of complicated fury. "I want, just once, for someone in that building to say my actual name and mean it. And I want enough money that I never again have to sit on a kitchen floor eating cereal out of a box because I'm too scared to check my bank balance." "That," my mother said gently, "sounds like a much better plan than revenge, sweetheart. Revenge is expensive, and it doesn't pay rent. Being properly compensated for work you actually did, and being respected for it in writing, permanently, on paper, that pays rent for the rest of your life." I thought about that for days afterward, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you're not sure is actually worth keeping. Priya had asked me almost the same question, in different words, sitting in her office with the real plants. Desmond had asked me a version of it too, back on that 1:43 a.m. call, though he'd phrased it more like a dare than a question. How much do you want revenge, and how much do you want power? I think, in the end, the honest answer was that I wanted both, in careful proportion. I wanted Cole Whitfield to stand in a room and understand, completely and without any escape route, exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost him. And I wanted, walking out of that same room, to be someone with an actual future again, not someone defined forever by the worst 5 weeks of her professional life, but someone who had turned those 5 weeks into the foundation of something better. Priya called 2 days later with the finalized terms Praxis had come back with, after our 48-hour review window closed. She read them to me slowly, line by line, letting each number land fully before moving to the next, the way you'd read someone their own winning lottery numbers back to them to make sure it was real. I won't share the exact figure here. It doesn't matter for the story, and honestly, it's mine now, in a way I'm still learning to be private and protective about. What I'll say is that it was enough. More than enough. Enough that the $12 checking account balance from 5 weeks earlier felt, suddenly, like it belonged to a different person entirely. Someone I remembered with something close to tenderness rather than shame. "There's one more thing," Priya said before we hung up. "Praxis wants to know if you'd be willing to meet with Halcyon one final time, formally, before anything closes. Not to negotiate. The negotiation is effectively already over, and they've already lost. But to give you the room, if you want it, to say whatever you need to say to Cole Whitfield's face, on the record, before this whole thing becomes lawyers and paperwork and quiet wire transfers, instead of actual human beings in an actual room. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took to draw one full breath. Yes, I said. I want the room. The conference room looked like every sterile war chamber I'd ever sat in during 14 years of corporate life. Glass walls on 3 sides, aggressive overhead lighting designed to make everyone look slightly unwell, a sad carafe of coffee on a side table that no one was ever, under any circumstances, going to actually drink. But this time the tension in the air wasn't the low fluorescent hum of a normal Tuesday stand-up. This was something closer to blood in the water, thick enough that you could almost taste the copper of it. I sat at the long table with Priya beside me in a blazer that probably cost more than a month of my old rent, her legal pad open in front of her, untouched, because we both already knew exactly how this was going to go, and neither of us needed notes to remember it. Across from us sat Cole Whitfield, flanked by 2 men in suits so stiff and so new they looked freshly unboxed for the occasion. One was in-house counsel, a nervous, younger man who kept adjusting his tie like it was strangling him, which, given the room, it might well have been. The other had the specific smirk of someone who bills by the hour and has never once had to personally worry about making rent. The kind of smirk that costs a company more in the long run than it ever saves them in the short term. Cole smiled at me when I walked in, a smile that didn't come anywhere close to reaching his eyes. The same smile he used to wear during employee appreciation town halls, right before announcing a hiring freeze. Nora, great to see you. Really glad we could all get in a room together like professionals after everything. I said nothing. I set my folder down, opened it, and placed a pen precisely in position. The same small ritual I used to perform before every difficult meeting I'd ever sat through in this exact building. Except this time, the ritual felt like armor instead of anxiety. He cleared his throat, glancing briefly at his lawyers before continuing. Look, we all know there's been some confusion here, some miscommunication, on both sides, honestly. None of us want this to turn into a full-blown legal mess. It's bad for optics, bad for morale, and frankly, Nora, it's bad for everybody's reputation, including yours if this drags out publicly. Priya tilted her head, the smallest possible movement. You mean your reputation? He ignored her entirely, turning back to me with the same faux fatherly warmth he trotted out on that first phone call. I remember when you first started here. You were sharp, quiet. First one in every morning, last one out every night. Some of your commits genuinely kept this whole platform alive during years we should have folded twice over. I waited. I let him keep walking straight into it, the way you let a man keep digging a hole he doesn't yet realize he's standing at the bottom of. We made mistakes, he continued, and I noticed, almost clinically, that he still hadn't managed to say the word I once. Not even now, not even here. Nobody in this room is denying that. But you also have to admit, filing that patent without the company's knowledge, keeping it quiet for 4 years, that was, in its own way, a little sneaky, Nora. We all slipped a little, somewhere along the line. We can fix this, together, as a team, the way we always used to. The lawyer beside him slid a document across the table, the paper making a soft, expensive sound against the glass. We're prepared to offer a full retroactive compensation package, along with an incentive structure to assign the patent rights back to Halcyon Systems in full. We'd also issue a formal press statement publicly crediting your original contributions to the platform. And, Cole added quickly, leaning forward like this was the part he'd been most proud of coming up with, we'd love to explore bringing you back in a new role. Consultant level, flexible hours, extremely well compensated. Genuinely, truly, no hard feelings on our end at all. I picked up the paper, flipped through it slowly, the way you'd flip through a takeout menu you already knew you weren't going to order from, and set it back down without a single word. I wrote code at 2 a.m, crying into a burrito, I said. Calm, even, quiet in the specific register that makes an entire room lean forward whether they mean to or not. Because someone changed the sprint scope without telling me, 3 days before launch. I worked straight through my mother's chemotherapy appointments because your release date could not, under any circumstances, move by even a single day. I built the core architecture this entire company was about to be valued at $640 million because of, while half the leadership team argued for 2 full hours in a meeting about what to name a Slack channel. And 15 days before you sold this company and personally cashed out, you had an automated system send me an email that didn't even have my name in it. The silence that followed hit the room like something physical, a pressure change you could feel in your ears. I gave you 14 years, I said. My health, my mother's last good years, most of which I spent half present because I was worried about your platform instead of worried about her. My mind, honestly, for a long stretch there. And in return, you gave me a form email and an NDA threat delivered by a courier who wouldn't make eye contact. Cole opened his mouth. I raised a single hand, and to my genuine surprise, he actually, physically, stopped. I don't want your apology, I said. I don't want your retroactive bonus. I don't want your consultant title, flexible hours or not. I stood, slid a single sheet of paper across the table, and let it come to rest directly in front of him. This is a fully executed, exclusive licensing agreement between myself and Praxis Dynamics, signed this morning. They're moving forward without you, Cole. They're licensing the patent directly from me because I own it outright and because they no longer need the dead weight of an acquisition target whose leadership tried to smear a former employee to a tech gossip blog 3 days before a scheduled negotiation. Cole went visibly completely white, the color draining out of his face in a way that would have been satisfying to watch in any other circumstance, and was, honestly, deeply satisfying to watch in this one, too. You don't have any proof of that, his lawyer started, sharp and immediate, the first real defensive move any of them had made all meeting. We have server logs, a sponsorship disclosure history, and a retraction email from the blog's editor-in-chief personally apologizing for running an unverified, unsourced piece, Priya said, not even glancing up from her still untouched legal pad. We were being polite by not opening with that. I'd recommend you not make us stop being polite. I leaned in, just close enough for Cole to fully understand exactly what losing smelled like at close range. Your merger is dead, I said. Your board is going to crucify you at the next quarterly meeting, and I genuinely hope someone records it. Your shareholders are going to eat whatever's left once the lawsuit's finished with you. I turned to Priya. We're done here. We walked out of that conference room to the sound of absolutely nothing at all. Not shouting, not a scrambled counteroffer, just the quiet, total collapse of a man who had spent his entire career assuming loyalty was a one-way street running only toward him, finally learning, in real time, in front of his own hand-picked legal team, exactly what happens when the quiet ones have been keeping receipts the entire time. We didn't speak until we were in the elevator, doors closed, the two of us alone in that small, mirrored box for the first time all day. Priya let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding, running a hand back through her hair, and for one brief second, she looked less like the Kraken and more like an actual human being who'd just watched something enormous happen and needed a moment to process it herself. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly, watching the floor numbers count down. Like I should feel more triumphant than I do. "That's normal," she said. "Everyone thinks the moment is going to feel like the movies. Music swelling, confetti, whatever. It never does. It just feels like relief, with the volume turned way, way down. Because your body's been braced for a fight for so long it doesn't know how to stand down all at once." Is it really over? Genuinely over, or is there some other shoe I don't know about yet? "The negotiation is over," she said. "The paperwork will take a few more weeks to fully finalize, and Halcyon's board is going to have an extremely bad month, possibly several extremely bad months. But none of that requires anything further from you. You did the hard part already, the part that mattered." The doors opened onto the lobby, all marble and cold morning light, and as we walked out, I caught, out of the corner of my eye, a small cluster of Halcyon employees near the security desk. People I recognized instantly. People I'd eaten lunch with 100 times. People who'd been in the building the day I got walked out and had, at the time, looked away rather than meet my eyes. The specific averted gaze of people who feel guilty, but not guilty enough to actually do anything about it. One of them was Jonah. He caught my eye across the lobby and, instead of looking away like the others, gave me the smallest, most deliberate nod I have ever received in my life. Not a wave, not a smile, just a nod. Quiet and certain, the kind that says, "I saw what happened in there, or I will hear about it within the hour, and I am glad. And I am sorry it took this long for anyone to make them care." I nodded back. I want to be honest about something else, because I think it's important for anyone reading this who's currently sitting on their own kitchen floor eating cereal out of a box, wondering if things like this actually happen to real people, or only in stories designed to make angry, unemployed engineers feel better for 20 minutes on a Tuesday night. It didn't happen all at once, the way it might in a movie. It happened in pieces, over the following weeks, each piece landing like a slow drumbeat instead of one dramatic crash. The first piece was a filing with the SEC, 3 days after the boardroom meeting, Halcyon formally announcing the collapse of the Praxis acquisition, citing unresolved intellectual property matters identified during due diligence. The stock, which had been privately valued in anticipation of the merger, took an immediate and brutal hit in the secondary markets, where employees had been quietly trading their vested shares. The second piece was a story, this time a real one, with a real byline in an actual respected trade publication, headlined, "Acquisition Collapses Amid IP Ownership Scandal at Halcyon Systems." This time my name wasn't hidden. The reporter had done her homework, and I'd agreed, on Priya's advice, to give one careful, measured, on-the-record quote. "I built the technology this company was valued on. I'm glad it's finally being credited to the person who actually created it." No anger in the words themselves. Priya said the calm would land harder than fury ever could, and she was right. It was the calm quote, not an angry one, that got screenshotted and shared across half of tech Twitter within a day. The third piece came a week later. "Shareholder revolt looms after Halcyon patent blunder." Apparently, one particularly furious early investor, a venture fund that had been promised a 9 times return on the Praxis deal and was now staring down the barrel of something closer to a total loss, had begun quietly organizing other shareholders toward a formal no-confidence vote on Cole's leadership. I heard, secondhand, through Jonah, that there had been a board meeting that ran nearly 9 hours, with at least one person allegedly storming out twice. The fourth piece was the one that surprised me the most, in a good way. Desmond forwarded me a link with no comment attached at all, just the URL, to a piece announcing that Halcyon's chief technology officer, the same man who had once introduced me as one of our support-level engineering resources, had resigned to pursue other opportunities, a phrase that means, in every industry I've ever worked in, exactly nothing and exactly everything at once. Cole held on for a while longer than I expected, actually. There's a specific kind of stubbornness in men who've never once faced real consequences. A genuine, bone-deep belief that the consequences must be a misunderstanding, a temporary rough patch, something that will resolve itself if you simply keep smiling in enough investor calls. But 6 weeks after the boardroom meeting, a short, carefully worded press release announced that Cole Whitfield would be stepping back from his role as CEO to pursue new ventures, with an interim leader named to steady the ship while the board conducted a comprehensive search for permanent leadership. I read that press release standing in my kitchen, coffee in hand, real coffee, from an actual bag with an actual roaster's name on it, not the sad break room pods I'd once considered a genuine perk of employment. And I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter and sturdier than joy. Something closer to closure. And then, 3 days after that press release, the voicemail came. I didn't answer the call. Of course I didn't. My phone still doesn't recognize any number associated with Halcyon Systems as anything other than a threat, and I don't imagine that's going to change anytime soon. But Cole left one anyway. 61 seconds long, sitting there in my voicemail inbox with its own small blue notification dot, patient and radioactive. I stared at it for a long time, long enough that my coffee went from hot to lukewarm on the counter beside me. Priya had told me, months earlier, that I'd know instinctively whether I wanted to hear whatever came next from him, and that either answer would be the right one, as long as it was actually mine and not something I did out of habit or obligation. I forwarded the voicemail, unheard, to Desmond with a single line of text. Me. Listen to this. We did it. He responded within minutes with a gif of a shark wearing sunglasses, riding a jet ski across an impossibly blue ocean, which is, I've come to understand, Desmond's entire emotional vocabulary distilled into a single reaction image. And somehow, it says everything it needs to say. I smiled, and then I deleted the voicemail without ever playing a single second of it. Some things don't need to be heard to be understood. I already knew roughly what it would say. An apology dressed up as an explanation. Maybe a guilt trip about how I'd torn everything down instead of working it out like professionals. Maybe, if I'm being generous, something that sounded almost like real regret, filtered through a man who has likely never once in his adult life said the words, "I was wrong," without immediately following them with a "but." I didn't need to hear any of it. I already knew what mattered, and it wasn't anything he had left to say to me. Good, I remember thinking, staring at the little notification disappearing off my screen for good. That was, after all, the entire point. 2 weeks after everything closed, I flew out to see Desmond. He'd been asking me to visit for years, in the vague, low-pressure way retired people invite you places, and I'd always meant to and never quite managed it, the way you always mean to call your grandmother back and somehow let 3 weeks slide by instead. His house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with citrus trees, exactly as advertised. Small orange and grapefruit trees, heavy with fruit that looked almost too perfect to be real, like a stock photo of retirement rather than an actual life. He met me at the door in a t-shirt that said something about a fishing tournament from what appeared to be at least a decade earlier, looking somehow both older and more relaxed than I remembered him ever being inside the walls of Halcyon. "You look terrible," he said by way of greeting, which from Desmond is roughly the equivalent of a warm embrace. "I look like a woman who just spent 5 weeks fighting a company and won," I said. "This is what winning looks like, apparently. Exhausting." He laughed, a real laugh this time, not the rusty gate sound from our phone calls, and waved me inside where he'd made too much coffee in a pot clearly designed for one person living alone, the extra now sitting in a thermos for later, which felt somehow like the most Desmond thing imaginable. We sat on his back porch for hours that afternoon, and for the first time since the whole ordeal started, I asked him the question I'd been carrying since that manila folder resurfaced in my memory weeks earlier. "Why did they really push you out, Desmond? You never told me the real reason, not once in 4 years." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly on the armrest of his chair. "I found something," he said finally. "Years before I gave you that folder. A pattern in how they were structuring engineer compensation versus what the company was actually valued at internally. In board documents I wasn't technically supposed to have access to, but did, because I'd built half the internal tools myself, and nobody had ever bothered to lock me out of anything. I brought it to the board, quietly, professionally. I thought, being an idiot in my own specific way, that they'd want to know they were sitting on a compliance problem before it became an actual scandal. And instead, 3 months later, my role was eliminated as part of a strategic restructuring." He said the phrase with a flat, practiced bitterness that told me he'd rehearsed saying it evenly many, many times over 4 years, sanding down the edges of his own anger the way you sand down a splinter until it stops catching on everything. Same language they used on you, I'd bet. "They're not creative people, Nora. They recycle everything, including their cruelty." "So the patent wasn't just insurance for me," I said slowly, understanding arriving in real time. "It was your way of getting the receipt they thought they'd erased." "It was both," he said. "I couldn't prove what I'd found in those board documents anymore. They'd have buried it, discredited me, made it about my performance instead of their numbers, the way these things always go. But I could make sure that somewhere, quietly, sitting outside their control, there was something real. Something they couldn't erase with an email that didn't have anyone's name on it. I just needed someone I trusted enough to hold on to it for me. Someone patient enough to wait, even if she didn't know what she was waiting for." I looked at him for a long moment. This strange, gruff, generous man who had spent 4 years of his own retirement quietly waiting for a storm he'd engineered the seeds of, purely so that someone else, me, could eventually walk away whole. "You could have told me," I said. "Any of it. All those years." "And you'd have spent 4 years anxious instead of 4 years simply doing good work and living your life," he said. "I made a calculation. I still think it was the right one. You got 14 good years at that company before the bad ending, Nora. I made sure the bad ending had teeth." I didn't have anything to say to that for a while. We just sat there, watching the light change over the citrus trees. 2 people who'd both, in their own ways, been chewed up and spit out by the same building, finally sitting on the same side of something. "Thank you," I said eventually, because it needed saying out loud, plainly, without irony. "Don't thank me," he said. "Buy me dinner. I'm retired, not made of money." People keep asking me what's next, now that the deal has closed and the story has, mostly, stopped being news. It's a fair question. It's also one I didn't have a real answer to for the first few weeks, because I'd spent so long defining myself by the work I did inside a building that no longer wanted me, that I hadn't fully considered who I was outside of it. The advisory role with Praxis turned out to be real, in a way corporate promises rarely are. I'm not managing anyone, which, after 14 years of watching bad managers fail upward, feels less like a demotion and more like a small mercy. I'm doing architecture work, the actual thing I loved before it got buried under 14 years of sprint planning and stakeholder alignment meetings that could have been emails, back when I was 26 and still believed that building something well was, by itself, enough to matter to the people paying for it. I brought Jonah over about a month after the deal closed. He'd stayed at Halcyon through the leadership chaos longer than I expected, mostly out of a loyalty to his own team that I understood completely, having felt it myself for over a decade. But once the interim CEO started quietly gutting engineering headcount to right-size operations ahead of a possible sale to someone other than Praxis, he called me, and I made one phone call to Denise Okoro, and within 2 weeks, he had an offer that actually respected what he was worth, on paper, with his actual name spelled correctly on it. I've started something else too, something smaller, something that's entirely mine in a way even the licensing deal isn't. A small consulting practice, nothing dramatic, no funding round, no ping pong table, just me and, as of last month, 2 other engineers I trust completely, doing architecture and systems work for companies who are willing to pay fairly for it up front, instead of dangling equity like a carrot in front of people who've learned, the hard way, exactly how little that carrot can be worth when the company that issued it decides you're disposable. I named it after Desmond, in a way he doesn't fully know about yet, and that I'm slightly nervous to tell him, because he'll almost certainly pretend to hate it while being secretly, deeply pleased. Okafor Systems Consulting. He earned it, 4 years before I even understood what he'd earned it for. I don't want to pretend this whole experience left me with some clean, uncomplicated moral about corporate justice always finding its way to the deserving. It didn't. For every Jonah who called to apologize for being used as a pawn, there were 3 or 4 people from Halcyon who never reached out at all. People I'd sat next to for years. People whose kids' names I knew. People who had watched me get walked out of the building with a cardboard box and a security escort, and simply gone back to their desks afterward. Because that's what you do when the alternative is drawing attention to yourself in a building where attention has apparently become dangerous. I don't hate them for it. Not really. Or at least I'm trying hard not to. Because I understand the calculus. Most of them have mortgages. Most of them have kids in daycare that costs more per month than my first apartment's entire rent. Most of them watched what happened to me and made a quiet, entirely rational decision that their own survival mattered more than solidarity with someone already gone. I understand that. I lived inside that same calculus myself for 14 years, choosing the safe, quiet path more times than I'd like to admit, right up until the day the choice was made for me. What I do think about, sometimes, late at night when the adrenaline of the whole ordeal has fully worn off and I'm just left with the quiet residue of it, is how many other Noras are still sitting inside buildings just like Halcyon right now, still doing exceptional work, still being quietly told they're not quite director ready yet, still years away from finding out whether anyone ever built them a Desmond-shaped insurance policy, or whether they're simply going to get walked out one day with a cardboard box and nothing at all waiting for them on the other side. I think about that a lot, actually. It's part of why I started actually writing this whole thing down, beyond just processing it for myself. If even one engineer reading this, One quiet, careful, underestimated person currently being told their work is support level by someone who couldn't debug their way out of a paper bag, decides to ask a few more questions about what they've actually built and who legally owns it, then whatever discomfort came from reliving all of this publicly was worth it. My new office is quiet, not sterile, not cold, the way Halcyon's glass-walled conference rooms always felt. All that transparency somehow making everyone feel more watched instead of more open. Quiet in the good way. Thick glass, warm wood, air that doesn't smell faintly of burnt break room coffee and unspoken desperation. A view of the water that makes even my most stubborn, well-earned cynicism sit down and be quiet for a minute or two at a time. The nameplate on the door reads, N. Callahan, Strategic Advisor, IP and Systems Architecture. Not associate. Not support-level resource. Not team lead with no actual team, a title I genuinely held for 8 months once. A fact I only find funny now, in hindsight, with several years of distance and a considerably larger bank balance. Just my name, spelled correctly, meaning exactly what it says. I still keep the cardboard box from the day they walked me out, actually. It's in my closet at home, mostly empty now except for a few things I never bothered unpacking. A stress ball shaped like a server rack that someone gave me at a conference years ago. A lanyard with a badge that no longer opens any doors anywhere. A sticky note, in Desmond's handwriting, that says simply, Insurance. Dated 4 years before any of this began. I keep it because I think it's important, sometimes, to remember exactly where you started, especially on the days when the new office and the water view start to feel like they were somehow inevitable, instead of the result of one very specific, very lucky comment buried in a block of old code that I almost didn't bother reading that afternoon. I think about that a lot, too, how close the whole thing came to never happening at all. If I hadn't opened that terminal, if I hadn't scrolled back through years of old commits out of some restless, grief-adjacent impulse I couldn't fully name at the time, if Jonah's text had come an hour later, after I'd already given up and gone to bed, and I'd simply read the merger headline the next morning with a shrug and moved on with my job search, never once connecting it to myself. I don't believe in fate particularly. I believe in Desmond, and in the specific, deliberate, 4 years in advance kindness of a man who saw a storm coming and built someone a boat instead of just warning them to run. I want to tell you about one specific moment, because I think it matters more than the boardroom scene, more than the headlines, more than any of the parts of this story that sound good when you say them out loud at a dinner party. About 6 weeks after the deal closed, once the wire transfer had actually landed and cleared, and I'd stopped compulsively refreshing my banking app every 90 minutes like it might disappear if I looked away too long, I sat down one evening and pulled up my old bank statements from the worst of it. The 5 weeks between the firing and the headline, back when I was tracking every single purchase down to the penny. Back when a $12 checking account balance had been a real, specific, terrifying number I stared at on a Sunday night, doing math in my head about whether I could stretch a box of pasta and a jar of sauce across 4 more days. I found the exact transaction. $12.41, a Sunday evening, 11 weeks before everything changed. I'd bought a single roll of paper towels and a can of cat food, and I remember standing in that grocery store aisle doing silent, humiliating arithmetic, trying to figure out whether I could afford both or whether the cat food had to win and I'd use a dish towel instead for another week. I sat with that memory for a long time that evening in my new apartment, with money in the bank that no longer required arithmetic to understand, and I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I felt something closer to grief for the version of myself standing in that aisle, doing that math, who had no idea, genuinely no idea, that somewhere in an old external hard drive gathering dust in a drawer, there was an answer to a question she didn't even know to ask yet. I think that's the part of stories like this that gets lost in the retelling. The part that doesn't make it into the headline or the confrontation scene or the satisfying moments where the bad boss goes pale across a conference table. The actual texture of being that scared, that reduced, that quietly humiliated by a system that asks you to build its entire fortune with your bare hands and then discards you the moment it's convenient, without so much as your name in the email. I don't ever want to forget that feeling completely, even now. Even with the new office and the water view and the nameplate with my correctly spelled name on it. I think forgetting it entirely would be its own kind of loss, a kind of amnesia that makes it easier, eventually, to become the very thing that did this to me in the first place. I want to remember the fear specifically so I never build a company, if I ever get big enough to build one, that treats a single person the way Halcyon treated me, or the way Halcyon treated Desmond 4 years before that, or the way it's probably treating someone else right now, in some cubicle I'll never see, doing brilliant work that no one in leadership will bother to learn the correct pronunciation of, let alone the name attached to it. My mother flew out 3 months after everything closed. The first time she'd seen my new office in person. The first time, honestly, she'd seen any office of mine that wasn't a photo I'd sent her from my phone during a lunch break years earlier, back when Halcyon still felt like something worth being proud of showing her. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it all in. The glass, the warm wood, the water beyond the window catching the afternoon light in a way that genuinely does look different depending on the hour. Something I've come to notice now that I actually have the mental space to notice things like light again. "Well," she said finally, running her fingers lightly along the edge of the nameplate on the door, tracing the letters like she was checking they were real. N. Callahan, Strategic Advisor. "That's me," I said, feeling suddenly, strangely shy about it. The way you feel showing a parent something you've built that they weren't there to watch you build, piece by piece. The way they were there for every skinned knee and school project growing up. "Your father would have loved this," she said quietly, and I felt something catch in my throat. Because my father died the year before I started at Halcyon, and some part of me has spent 14 years quietly building things, partly for an audience that was never going to see any of them. He always said you had more patience than anyone he'd ever met. I used to think that was just a nice thing to say about a kid who didn't throw tantrums. I don't think I understood, until this whole thing happened, that patience like yours isn't passive. It's a kind of weapon, if you aim it right. I thought about Desmond saying something almost identical, months earlier, on that back porch surrounded by citrus trees. They mistook that for weakness instead of what it actually was, which is patience. And I wondered, not for the first time, how many people in my life had quietly understood something about me that I'd taken 14 years and one catastrophic firing to understand about myself. "I kept the box," I told her, "from the day they walked me out. I still have it in my closet." She looked at me for a long moment, something soft and knowing passing over her face. "Good," she said. "Keep it somewhere you can see it, eventually, once it stops hurting to look at. Not to torture yourself, just so you remember exactly how far the walk actually was." People ask me this constantly, more than almost any other question, so I'll answer it here directly instead of letting it hang unresolved. Cole Whitfield did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that up front because I know some of you are hoping for a tidier ending than reality typically provides, and I'd rather disappoint you now than let you assume something that isn't true. What actually happened was quieter, and in some ways more fitting. After stepping down as CEO, he took what the press releases delicately called a brief sabbatical, which lasted, as far as I can tell from the outside, almost a full year. He resurfaced eventually as an executive advisor at a much smaller startup, the kind of company that hasn't yet learned to properly vet the people it brings on, the kind of company that saw former Halcyon CEO on a resume and didn't dig any further into what that title had actually cost the people underneath him. I don't know how long that lasted. I stopped tracking him closely after the first year, partly because Priya advised it. Don't give him rent in your head, Nora. He's not paying for the space. And partly because I noticed, somewhere around month 8, that I genuinely stopped caring in the way I once had. Not because I'd forgiven him exactly, more because the version of me who needed to track his every move to feel like justice was actually real had slowly, quietly become someone else. Someone whose sense of being okay no longer depended on watching someone else not be okay. The last I heard, secondhand, through an industry mutual, he was consulting independently. The vague, unverifiable kind of consulting that men like Cole tend to drift into once the doors that used to open automatically for them stop doing so. I don't feel triumphant about that particularly. I feel something closer to a kind of tired acceptance. The understanding that men like Cole rarely get the dramatic downfall the story wants for them. They mostly just fade, slowly, into smaller and smaller rooms, still telling the same stories about themselves to people who haven't yet learned better. The system that let him treat people the way he treated me and Desmond and, I imagine, a dozen others whose names I'll never know. That system is still mostly intact. I didn't burn it down. I found one very specific, very personal way through one very specific door. And I got myself and a few people I care about safely on the other side of it. I think that's honest. And I think it's important to say plainly, because I've watched enough of these stories online to know how tempting it is to end on a note of total sweeping justice that isn't quite earned by what actually happened. What I earned was smaller and, I've come to believe, more durable. I earned proof, permanent and legally binding and impossible to take back, that the work I did mattered, that it was mine, and that no automated email without my name in it could ever change that fact again. My new office is quiet, not sterile, not cold, the way Halcyon's glass conference rooms always somehow manage to feel despite, or maybe because of, all that transparency. Quiet in the good way, thick glass, warm wood, air that doesn't carry the faint burnt smell of break room coffee and unspoken dread. A view of the water that catches different light depending on the hour. Something I notice now. Something I have room in my life to notice now, which might be the single biggest change in all of this. Not the money, not the title, but the simple fact that I have mental space again to notice small, unimportant, beautiful things. The deal with Praxis closed formally just over a year ago now. The final number is mine to keep private, and I intend to keep it that way. But I'll say this much. I will never again do quiet, humiliating arithmetic in a grocery store aisle over a can of cat food. They didn't just license the patent in the end, as I mentioned. They bought it outright, along with an advisory role that came with an amount of flexibility that would make most people weep. A signing bonus that genuinely did make me weep, alone, in my car, in a grocery store parking lot. The same grocery store where I'd once done that terrible arithmetic, which felt like its own small, private, perfect kind of justice that no one else needed to witness for it to count. Priya handled the closing like the surgeon Desmond had always promised she'd be. Desmond sent one single text message the moment the wire actually cleared. Told you. Welcome to the food chain. I've saved that text. I don't think I'll ever delete it. Halcyon Systems, for its part, never fully recovered its footing. It still exists, technically, smaller now, quieter, absorbed eventually by a company I'd never heard of before, for a fraction of what it had once been worth on paper. I don't feel much of anything about that anymore, honestly. Which surprised me the first time I noticed it. I expected the satisfaction to last longer than it did. Instead, somewhere around the 8 or 9 month mark, I simply stopped thinking about them at all, most days. Which turned out to be its own kind of victory. Quieter than the boardroom one, but somehow more complete. I walked to the window this afternoon, the same way I have most afternoons for the past year, and watched the light change on the water. No dramatic music swelled behind me. No sudden rush of euphoria arrived to mark the occasion. Just quiet. The specific, hard-won kind of quiet that arrives only after the engine finally stops screaming. After you finally understand, in your body and not just your head, that you're not falling anymore. You're flying. You were flying for a while before you even noticed. I didn't feel victorious, in the end. Not in the way I expected to feel back when I was sketching out fantasies of that boardroom confrontation on my kitchen floor, eating cereal from the box. I felt something better than victorious. I felt free. Free of the specific, corrosive fear that had quietly organized my entire adult life around the question of whether I was doing enough, working hard enough, staying late enough to earn a security that, it turns out, no amount of overtime could have ever purchased from people who never intended to pay it out in the first place. Let the vultures choke wherever they land next, on whatever golden parachute they manage to grab on the way down. Let the lawsuits and the shareholder revolts and the slow, humiliating fade into irrelevance do whatever quiet work they're going to do, on their own schedule, without any further help from me. Let the whole rotten system keep devouring itself, one careless email at a time, while I build something slower, smaller, kinder if it can be, meaner if it has to be, but mine, all the way down to the bones, in a way nothing at Halcyon Systems ever fully was, even during the years I loved it. I picked up my coffee, real coffee, from beans with an actual name and an actual story, not a break room pod with an expiration date from 2 administrations ago. And I got back to work. Thank you for sitting with this whole story, all the way to the end. I know it's a long one. I wanted to actually do it justice, instead of rushing to the satisfying part and skipping over everything that made it worth telling in the first place. If you've ever been the person doing the work while someone else's name ends up on the credit, I hope some part of this landed the way it was meant to. Hit subscribe if you want more of these. Unless, of course, you happen to be my old CEO, in which case, genuinely, good luck out there. You're going to need it. I've had a lot of messages since parts of this story started making the rounds. Engineers mostly, but also designers, product managers, one very kind accountant who said the specifics were different, but the shape of the betrayal felt identical. A lot of them ask some version of the same question. What should I actually be doing differently, right now, before anything like this ever happens to me? I'm not a lawyer, and I want to be careful not to present myself as one, because Priya would absolutely materialize in my kitchen to correct me if I started handing out legal advice I'm not qualified to give. But I can tell you what I wish someone had told me at 26. Back when I was too grateful for a decent salary and a seat at the table to ask hard questions about who actually owned the things I was building. Read your employment agreement, all of it, including the parts about invention assignment, including the parts that feel like boilerplate nobody actually reads. I didn't. Not carefully, not for years. Because I trusted the company the way you trust a person you've had a few good years with, forgetting that a company is not a person and does not have the capacity for loyalty the way a person does, no matter how many times it tells you that you're part of the family. Keep your own records, not to steal anything, not to violate any NDA, but simply to know, for yourself, privately, exactly what you built and when you built it. I nearly lost the thread of my own history entirely, buried under years of sprint retros and performance review language designed specifically to make individual contribution hard to isolate and harder to prove. Find your own Desmond, if you can. Not necessarily someone who's going to file a secret patent on your behalf. That's a fairly unusual set of circumstances, and I don't think it's realistic advice for most people. But someone senior, somewhere in your career, who tells you the truth even when it's inconvenient, who warns you about the kombucha tap and the culture it's covering for. Those people are rare, and they are worth every bit of loyalty you can spare them, because the company itself will very rarely deserve that same loyalty back. And if it happens to you, if you get an email one day that doesn't have your name in it, that reduces years of your life to a single sterile sentence, give yourself permission to grieve it first, properly, without rushing straight to the fight. I ate a lot of dry cereal on a lot of kitchen floors before I was ready to open that old terminal and start digging. That wasn't weakness. That was just being human about something that hurt exactly as much as it should have hurt. The fight will still be there once you're ready for it. Mine certainly was. I'm writing this last part almost exactly 1 year to the day after that first email arrived, the one without my name in it, the one that started all of this without my having the faintest idea it was starting anything at all. My cat is asleep on my desk right now. The same one who once knocked a mug of stale Cheerios off my kitchen counter and didn't even seem to notice the significance of the moment, which I think is probably the correct amount of significance for a cat to assign to a career-defining catastrophe. Okafor Systems Consulting has 6 clients now, small but growing, all of them paying fairly, all of them getting exactly what they're paying for, no more and no less, which turns out to be a genuinely radical way to run a business once you've spent 14 years inside one that operated on the opposite principle. Jonah's doing well at Praxis. He sends me memes sometimes from the internal Slack, the good kind, the kind that makes fun of the absurdity of corporate life without any real venom behind it, because Praxis, whatever its flaws, and it has them, every company does, has never once made him feel disposable the way Halcyon did. Desmond visited last month, up from Florida, complaining the entire time about the cold the way only a man who spent 4 years surrounded by citrus trees can complain about 62 degrees. He looked at the new office, at the nameplate, at the small framed photo I keep on my desk of the 2 of us at his house that afternoon on the porch, and he didn't say much. He just nodded once, the same quiet, deliberate nod Jonah gave me across that lobby a year ago, the kind that says everything it needs to say without spending a single unnecessary word on it. I think about the woman on the kitchen floor sometimes, the one with the hole in her leggings and the $12 balance, and the certainty, deep and quiet and completely wrong, that she'd never matter to anyone the way her work had mattered to a building full of people who couldn't be bothered to remember her name. I wish I could go back and tell her what was coming. I wish I could tell her that the comment buried in that old code, the one she almost didn't bother reading, was going to change absolutely everything. But I think, honestly, she needed to find it herself, in her own time, in her own way, scrolling through the bones of a life she didn't have anymore, looking for something she didn't yet know she was looking for. She found it. That's the whole story, really, underneath all the boardrooms and headlines and slow, satisfying collapses. A woman who built something extraordinary with her own 2 hands, who was told for 14 years that her contribution was somehow smaller than it actually was, and who finally, one Tuesday afternoon, found the proof that said otherwise, sitting quietly in a database, waiting exactly where a good and stubborn friend had left it for her 4 years earlier. If that's you right now, if you're sitting somewhere doing extraordinary, uncredited work for people who will never say your name correctly, let alone gratefully, I hope you find your own version of that comment in the code. I hope it's there when you finally go looking. And if it isn't yet, I hope you start building it today, quietly, patiently, the way Desmond built mine, so that whoever needs it someday, maybe you, maybe someone you're mentoring right now without even realizing it, has somewhere real to stand when the ground finally gives way. Thank you, truly, for staying with this whole story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And hit that subscribe button, unless, again, you happen to be my old CEO. In that case, I hear consulting is going well for you these days. Genuinely, good luck out there. I said I'd tell you about the box again before I finished, so here it is, the last thing I want to leave you with. It's still there, in my closet, exactly where I put it a year ago. A plain cardboard box, the kind every office keeps a stack of near the elevator for exactly this purpose, as if getting fired is such a routine occurrence that a company needs standing inventory for it. Inside is a stress ball shaped like a server rack, a lanyard with a badge that opens nothing anymore, a mug with a chip in the handle that I somehow couldn't bring myself to throw away, even though I have nicer mugs now, mugs that didn't survive 5 weeks of unemployment serial. And underneath all of it, folded carefully, is the original certified letter from Whitcomb, Farrow & Signs, the one that arrived on a Tuesday and rearranged the entire shape of my life within about 11 minutes of me opening it. I kept that too. Priya thought I was being sentimental. Desmond thought it was the single most practical thing I'd done in the whole ordeal, evidence being evidence, and he's not wrong. But that's not really why I kept it. I kept it because I want to remember, on the days when the new office and the water view and the quiet, comfortable hum of a life that finally has room to breathe in it start to feel like they were somehow inevitable, that none of it was inevitable at all. It was one comment in a block of old code that I almost didn't bother rereading. It was one mentor who spent 4 quiet years building a bunker under my feet without asking me to carry any of that weight until I was ready for it. It was one lawyer who answered her phone at a strange hour and laughed, the kind of laugh that told me instantly I'd finally found someone in my corner. It was one friend who couldn't quite manage to look away from a lobby full of averted eyes. And it was one woman, sitting on a kitchen floor with a hole in her leggings and a box of dry cereal, who could have very easily closed that laptop, sent her resume out into the void one more time, and never once gone looking for what was quietly waiting for her. She didn't close the laptop. That's the whole thing, in the end. Underneath every headline in every boardroom and every satisfying slow collapse of a man who thought loyalty only ever needed to run in one direction. She kept the terminal open. She kept scrolling. She found the line that mattered. I think that's the only piece of advice actually worth ending on. More than anything about employment contracts or patent filings or which lawyer to call at 2 in the morning. Keep the terminal open. Whatever your version of that is, whatever old file, whatever forgotten conversation, whatever quiet, dismissed instinct that something you built once mattered more than you were ever told it did. Keep scrolling. Some of us don't find the line that changes everything until we're already sitting on the floor. And that's all right. That's more than all right. That's exactly when a lot of us finally have nothing left to lose. And nothing left to lose turns out to be its own strange, unexpected kind of freedom. I still eat cereal out of the box sometimes, honestly, on lazy Sunday mornings, in my new kitchen, with a view I still haven't fully gotten used to having. But now I do it because I want to, sitting at an actual table, in an actual chair, with an actual choice in front of me about how to spend the day. Not because washing a bowl felt like more than I could manage. That difference between doing something out of collapse and doing the exact same small thing out of choice turns out to be the entire distance between the woman I was a year ago and the woman writing this to you now. It doesn't look like much from the outside. A bowl, a chair, a Tuesday that's just a Tuesday again, instead of the emotional landfill of the week. But I promise you, from the inside, it's everything. Thank you for reading this whole thing, start to finish. Keep your receipts. Keep your terminal open. And keep going, even on the floor, especially on the floor. Because you genuinely never know what's still quietly waiting for you a few commits back, filed under someone else's careful, patient handwriting, just waiting for the day you finally go looking. A few people have asked me in messages why I chose to tell this whole story publicly at all, instead of just quietly living the better life it bought me and letting Halcyon Systems fade into the kind of obscurity most failed mergers eventually fade into, forgotten by everyone except the people who lived through it. The honest answer is that for a long time, I didn't plan to. I thought I'd keep it entirely private, the way I've kept the exact settlement number private, the way I've kept most of the smaller, uglier details of that year to myself, shared only with Priya and Desmond and my mother and the handful of people who were actually there for it. What changed my mind was a message from someone I've never met, a junior engineer at a company I won't name, who wrote to say that reading about the Manila folder, about Desmond's 4 years of quiet patience, had made her go back and actually read her own employment agreement for the first time in 3 years of working there. She found a clause she didn't understand. She asked a lawyer friend about it. It turned out to be nothing, in her specific case. No hidden patent, no secret leverage, just an ordinary, boring, standard clause that meant exactly what it appeared to mean. But she told me that the simple act of finally reading it, of finally taking her own contribution seriously enough to ask the question, had changed something in how she showed up to work the next Monday. Small, she said. Nothing dramatic. Just different. That's really the whole reason I sat down and wrote all of this out, start to finish, longer and slower than I originally intended, instead of just posting a short, satisfying summary of the boardroom scene and calling it done. I wanted the version of this story that actually shows the boring, unglamorous, essential parts too. The 5 weeks of dry cereal, the $12 balance, the quiet terror of not knowing if you'll ever matter to anyone the way your work mattered to a building that discarded you without your name attached. Because I think that's the part most of these stories skip past too quickly, in the rush to get to the satisfying confrontation. And I think skipping it does a disservice to everyone still sitting in the middle of their own version of it. Not yet at the boardroom, not yet at the closing, just sitting on the floor, wondering if any of it is ever going to change. It changes. Not always the way you expect, not always as fast as you need it to, and not always with the clean, cinematic justice these stories tend to promise, but it changes. Keep the terminal open. I mean that as sincerely as I've meant anything in this entire story. That's it. That's everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. If any part of this helped, even a small part, even just the part about actually reading your employment agreement for once, then it did exactly what I hoped it would do when I finally sat down to write it. Take care of yourselves out there, and take care of the people quietly building things next to you, who might need a Desmond of their own someday, whether they know it yet or not. I'll close with this, because it seems to be what people want to know most, more than the legal mechanics or the exact settlement figure or even what finally happened to Cole. They want to know how I feel now, today, sitting here writing the last few lines of something that took an entire year of my life to actually live through, and several long nights to properly put into words. I feel, most days, ordinary. That's the strange, quiet surprise nobody tells you about on the other side of a story like this one. You expect to feel transformed, permanently, in some grand and visible way. Instead, you mostly just feel like yourself again, except with better sleep, and a nameplate that spells your name correctly, and a bank account that no longer requires quiet grocery store arithmetic, and a cat who has never once cared about any of it, one way or the other. And honestly, some days, that indifference from a small orange animal is the most grounding thing in my entire life. I still get nervous before big meetings. I still second-guess a difficult email before I hit send. I still, occasionally, catch myself bracing for a version of Cole Whitfield to appear out of nowhere and take something away from me again. The old fear surfacing in small, unexpected moments. A phone call from an unfamiliar number. A certified letter I wasn't expecting. The particular dread of an inbox notification arriving too early in the morning. I don't think that fear ever fully leaves you once you've lived through something like this. I think you just get better, slowly, at recognizing it for what it is and choosing not to let it drive. What's different, underneath all of that, is the quiet certainty I carry now that I didn't carry before. The certainty that whatever I build next, wherever I build it, my name is going to be on it, correctly spelled, properly credited, impossible for anyone to quietly erase with an automated system and a single sterile sentence. That certainty is worth more to me than the settlement number, more than the water view, more than anything else this whole ordeal handed me. If you take one thing away from this story, past the boardroom, past Desmond and his citrus trees, past the $12 balance and the certified letter on a Tuesday, let it be that. Build things you can point to and say plainly, without apology, I made that, and it was mine, and no one gets to tell me otherwise ever again. That's the whole story. Thank you, truly, for reading every word of it.